The sound of the lawn mower hummed steadily across Maplewood Lane, a pristine suburban street where every hedge was trimmed like clockwork and every family kept up appearances. At number 18, the Whitmores' front yard gleamed with perfect green grass and tasteful garden gnomes, the kind that smiled politely at passers-by. Inside, however, the air buzzed with tension thicker than the mid-June humidity. Janet Whitmore stared at the overdue mortgage notice in her hand, her jaw tightening. 3 months behind, she muttered, eyes scanning the figures again as if disbelief could change the math. Her husband, Greg, sipped his coffee silently, the morning paper barely hiding the worry in his eyes. They had done everything right, or so they thought. Greg's business had slowed. Their savings had thinned. And now the bank was circling. Across the street, at number 21, lived the Johnsons. They were a quiet black family, 2 parents, 1 teenage daughter, and an older man who rarely left the porch swing. To the Whitmores and most of the neighborhood, they were polite, reserved, and, frankly, invisible. Janet often whispered judgments behind closed doors. Probably renters, she'd say to her friends during wine nights. Nice people, sure, but not, established. Don't you think it's strange, she'd say to Greg, how they moved into a neighborhood like this? On that income? Greg didn't usually respond. He just grunted and turned the channel. That Friday afternoon, Janet was trimming her roses when she saw Mariah Johnson, the daughter, step out in a designer dress and heels that didn't match Janet's mental image of humble living. The girl climbed into a sleek black car, waved to her father, and drove off like she belonged to another world entirely. Janet scoffed. Probably on food stamps and still blowing money on Gucci. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the Johnsons weren't renters. And they weren't struggling. Not even close. Greg Whitmore had a hard time concentrating at work the following week. The constant reminder of overdue bills gnawed at him. He hadn't mentioned it to Janet, but he'd been secretly reaching out to his business partners, trying to arrange a loan, any loan, to keep things afloat. The walls felt like they were closing in. Meanwhile, across the street, Mr. Johnson, Derek, sat in his usual spot on the porch swing, watching the world go by. A gray-haired man in his late 50s, Derek had an air of quiet authority, though he rarely spoke to anyone other than his family. Yet, those who really took the time to observe him knew there was more to his silence. He had a history, a past his neighbors could never have imagined. Mariah Johnson had grown up under his stern but loving gaze, and though she hadn't understood it at the time, her father's aloofness had always been a shield. Behind that shield was a man who had built a quiet empire in the world of investments, quietly and discreetly accumulating wealth over the years. Derek had been a financier, an extremely successful one, with a portfolio of companies, properties, and stocks that most of Maplewood would find incomprehensible. He'd never flaunted it. He didn't need to. And Mariah? She wasn't driving around in a Gucci dress for nothing. She was no ordinary teenager. Mariah had grown up watching her parents maneuver through the world in ways no one could see or appreciate. The Johnsons weren't just wealthy, they were generationally wealthy, a fact hidden in plain sight behind their humble home and unassuming lives. Janet Whitmore's eyes widened as she pulled into her driveway that Thursday evening. A sleek black SUV was parked in front of the Johnsons' house. The windows were tinted, but there was something about it that caught her attention. Her curiosity piqued, she got out of the car slowly and glanced across the street. Mariah was laughing with a man in an expensive suit, clearly some sort of business associate. The two exchanged business cards, shaking hands like old friends. Janet furrowed her brow. I knew it, she muttered under her breath. She's up to something. Probably trying to hustle her way into that life. Greg stepped outside, his expression grim. He had just received a call that day. His business was now officially in jeopardy. The looming threat of foreclosure was imminent. His gut churned. He knew his pride was getting in the way of reality. But he also knew he needed help. I think we need to reach out to the Johnsons, he said quietly, his voice defeated. If we don't do something soon, we are done for. Janet's eyes widened in disbelief. The Johnsons? She scoffed. Why would we turn to them? They can barely take care of themselves, much less us. But Greg wasn't convinced. Maybe they've got more than they're letting on, even if they are in this type of neighborhood by charity. I think we need that charity to survive now. Or, maybe they know something we don't and don't just like to show off. The following day, Greg mustered the courage to knock on Derek Johnson's door. Janet stayed behind, pacing back and forth, her anxiety creeping up. She tried to ignore the pit in her stomach as she replayed the endless bills, the mortgage notices, the calls from the bank. Derek opened the door, his deep-set eyes scanning Greg with an air of quiet curiosity. He wasn't unkind, but he wasn't interested in small talk either. "I'm here to ask for your help," Greg said, his voice tight with the weight of desperation. I don't know who else to turn to." Derek raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He leaned against the door frame, waiting for Greg to continue. "Greg," his throat dry, swallowed. "The business, it's going under. We are behind on our mortgage, and I don't know how to fix it. Can you help us? I know you may not have any financial help to offer us, but maybe you can link us up with people that can help." Derek remained silent for a moment. His mind was racing, but his face remained impassive. "You've been kind to me and my family over the years," Derek said finally, his voice low. "But I'm afraid there's nothing I can do to help you." Greg's heart sank. "Please. Anything." Derek's eyes narrowed for a moment as he studied Greg. Then, with surprising calmness, he spoke again. "Let me show you something." He stepped aside and motioned for Greg to follow. Greg hesitated but stepped inside, still grasping at the thread of hope Derek might offer. The inside of the Johnsons' home was modest but well-maintained. Nothing screamed luxury, but there were signs of wealth that could easily go unnoticed by someone not paying attention. Antique furniture, an impressive collection of art, and even a wine cellar that would make most sommeliers envious. "Take a seat," Derek said, gesturing toward a plush leather chair by the fireplace. As Greg sat, Derek disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a folder of documents. Greg stared at the papers, his confusion growing. "These are the financial statements of my business," Derek said. "I run an investment firm, something I've kept to myself for a long time. But if you want to know the truth, I have the means to help you." Greg's breath caught in his throat. He stared at Derek, who had just revealed that his humble family was sitting on a fortune that could easily cover Greg's debts and more. "I've watched you struggle," Derek continued, his voice steady. "I've seen the signs. But I've also seen your pride, and I respected it. I know how it feels to protect your family from embarrassment, from judgment. But sometimes, you need to let go of that pride." Greg's mind was spinning. His neighbors, the Johnsons, had been quietly living in an entirely different world. He had underestimated them, assuming their reserved lifestyle meant they were poor, just as Janet had whispered behind closed doors. "I can help you, but you'll have to accept it," Derek said calmly. Greg nodded slowly, his heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and shame. "Thank you," he whispered. We'll take anything." The days following Greg's visit to Derek Johnson's home were a blur. A mixture of disbelief, guilt, and growing relief clouded his mind. Janet still hadn't fully grasped what had happened, and she remained hesitant, even suspicious. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the Johnsons, despite Derek's offer, despite the kind of help that seemed almost too easy. "I don't trust them," Janet said one evening as they sat in their kitchen, the overhead light casting a dull glow over her anxious face. "What's their angle, Greg? People don't just give away that kind of money." Greg sighed, running his hands through his hair. "They're not giving away money. They're offering to invest in the business, help us get back on our feet. You heard Derek. He's not some small-time guy. He knows what he's doing." Janet crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her expression hard. "I don't care how much money they have, Greg. I care about where it's coming from." Greg had had enough of the skepticism. He slammed his hand down on the table. "What's wrong with accepting help? You heard what he said, he's been watching us struggle. And for once, someone sees what we are going through." She looked at him, hurt in her eyes. "So, you're just going to let them fix everything? You think they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts?" Greg hesitated, his voice softer. "I think they're doing it because they understand what it's like to be at the bottom. They get it." The next morning, the reality of the situation began to settle in for both families. Derek had set up a meeting at his office, a modest building on the edge of the city. When Greg arrived, he was surprised by how unassuming it looked. Derek's investment firm was not a grandiose tower but a quiet, tucked-away office that seemed far from the glamorous financial world Greg had imagined. Inside, Derek handed Greg a cup of coffee, his face calm but alert. "This is a business arrangement, Greg," Derek began. "I'm offering to buy into your business, help you restructure, pay off the debts, and get you back on track. But this isn't charity. You'll have to work with me, put in the effort. If you succeed, we both benefit." Greg nodded, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes." As Derek outlined the terms of the agreement, Greg felt a sense of clarity begin to form. This wasn't just about money. This was about a partnership, something he'd never been comfortable with before, but something he desperately needed. It was the first step toward rebuilding not only his business but his dignity. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, restructuring, and late nights. Janet, though still unsure, began to notice changes, small ones at first. Greg's stress seemed to lift. The bills stopped piling up. Derek's investments were slowly breathing life into the business, giving Greg the breathing room he'd needed for months. But Janet wasn't convinced. She watched the Johnsons more closely now, scrutinizing every movement they made. She saw Mariah coming and going, attending meetings and events, her elegant dress a stark contrast to the quiet nature of their home. Janet couldn't help but feel a simmering resentment. How are they pulling all this off? Janet muttered under her breath one afternoon, staring across the street as Mariah stepped out of the SUV again. Greg, exhausted from the day's work, barely looked up. "They are successful, Janet. We've been wrong about them. They're not just getting by. They've been playing this game for a long time." Janet let out a frustrated breath. "It's just so hard to believe. It doesn't feel right. I don't know if I trust them, Greg." As the months passed, Greg's business began to show signs of real growth. Orders came in faster than they could process. Employees were hired. The Whitmores even managed to get their mortgage payments back on track, thanks to Derek's backing. But with success came a new set of pressures. Greg started to rely more heavily on Derek's advice, even stepping away from his previous partners to let Derek take the lead. It was becoming more and more clear that the Johnsons were steering the ship now, not Greg. Janet, still uneasy with their new reality, couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of her own life. The Whitmores' newfound success was built on the Johnsons' support, and it felt as though Greg was drifting farther away from her. The small family dynamic she'd fought so hard to maintain was slowly eroding, piece by piece. One evening, Janet sat in the kitchen, staring at the family photos on the wall, wondering how things had gone so wrong. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the simplicity of their previous life. As Janet continued to sit in the quiet of her kitchen, her thoughts spiraled. The once proud Whitmore family had been brought to the edge, and it wasn't just their finances that had taken a hit, it was their pride. She had been so sure that everything was fine, that she could hold it all together with just enough effort. But now, with the weight of Derek Johnson's offer looming over her, she couldn't help but wonder if her own stubbornness had cost them more than she realized. She had been resistant to accepting help from the Johnsons, unwilling to see past her own prejudices. But now, with Greg more relaxed and confident in his business dealings, the bills under control, and the business growing again, she knew deep down that they had only made it this far because of Derek's quiet intervention. Still, her pride, a trait she had fought so hard to maintain, wasn't ready to accept the truth. The Johnsons, who she had dismissed as poor and insignificant, had been the ones to save them. Her eyes drifted across the street again, where Derek sat, as usual, on his porch swing, watching the world go by in that calm, almost detached manner of his. She still didn't fully understand him, his quiet demeanor, his reluctance to flaunt his wealth. But the more she watched, the more she realized that he wasn't showing off or trying to impress anyone. He had simply lived his life in the way that made sense to him. As she stood up from the kitchen table, Janet knew what she had to do. There was no way to undo the past, no way to take back the judgment and assumptions she had made. But she could start by extending an olive branch. By facing the Johnsons, by understanding them better, and perhaps by admitting her own faults. The following morning, Janet was the one who stepped across the street first. Derek was outside, just as he always was, calmly sipping a cup of coffee. Mariah, dressed in a simple, elegant outfit, was in the driveway, packing something into the trunk of a car. "Mr. Johnson," Janet began, her voice steady but apologetic. Derek looked up, his eyes softening slightly. Janet. Good morning. I wanted to apologize. For everything, Janet said, her heart pounding in her chest. For the things I said, for not seeing things as they really were. Derek remained silent for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then he nodded slowly. We all make mistakes, Janet. It's how we learn from them that matters. Janet swallowed, trying to fight back the emotion welling up in her throat. I thought I knew everything, about you, about this neighborhood, about people like you. But I was wrong. And I'm sorry. For my assumptions. Derek regarded her quietly for a moment, then said, I know it's not easy to accept help. And it's especially hard when that help comes from somewhere you least expect. But sometimes, the real strength comes in letting go of pride and accepting what's offered, even when it's hard. Janet nodded, the weight of his words sinking in deeper than she'd expected. Thank you. For everything. I don't know if we would have made it without you. Derek gave a small smile. You did your part too, Janet. It's not just about money. It's about trust. And now, we move forward. Janet stood there for a moment, not sure what else to say. The resentment she'd held onto for so long was slowly starting to fade, replaced by something else, a sense of humility, of gratitude, and, maybe for the first time in her life, the recognition that she didn't know everything. Across the street, Greg watched from the window, his heart swelling with relief. Janet had taken the first step. The Whitmores were starting to see what they had missed, the true nature of the Johnsons. They had underestimated Derek and his family, but now, they could see the truth. The Johnsons weren't just their neighbors, they were their partners, and they were there for them in ways they hadn't even imagined. And as Janet walked back to the house, a silent understanding passed between her and Derek, a mutual recognition that despite their differences, they could learn from each other. In the end, that was what had brought them together, their shared humanity, their willingness to grow, and the realization that no one was truly alone in their struggles. The Whitmores, though initially reluctant, accepted Derek's offer to help them restructure their business. Over time, Greg became a trusted partner in Derek's investment firm, learning the intricacies of the financial world he had once dismissed. Janet, too, found a new perspective, shedding the prejudices that had once clouded her judgment. She became involved in local charity work, dedicated to helping families in need, particularly those who had been overlooked and underestimated, just like she had once been. As the years passed, the two families became close friends, their bond forged not just through business, but through shared experiences and understanding. The Johnsons, for their part, never sought recognition for their help, but quietly stood by, offering advice and wisdom when needed. The neighborhood, once divided by assumptions and misconceptions, began to change. The Whitmores, once the epitome of privilege and pride, learned that true strength lies in humility and the ability to ask for, and accept, help when it's needed. The journey of the Whitmores and the Johnsons is a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, and pride can be a heavy burden. Real success isn't about wealth or status, it's about the relationships we build, the trust we give, and the willingness to grow, both personally and as a community. Everyone has a story that deserves to be heard, and sometimes, the most unlikely sources can offer the help we need most. If you enjoy this story, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious, who knows what story we will uncover next.